My son hit my sick husband during dinner. The sound, a sharp and ugly crack, sliced through the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the gentle clinking of silverware. It was a sound that didn't belong in our home, a sound that shattered 60 years of memories built within these walls. What I did next left everyone speechless, but the truth is, my response had been building for months, a silent, cold pressure behind a dam of grief and fear. That slap was simply the final crack that brought the whole structure down. It began, as so many tragedies do, with a promise wrapped in the sweet, cloying language of concern. My Howard, my husband of 55 years, had begun his slow, cruel fade into the fog of dementia. At 85, his body was still strong, but his mind had become a labyrinth of half-forgotten corridors and locked doors. I was 71, and while my heart was determined, my body was beginning to betray me with the small aches and creeping fatigue of age. Managing Howard's confusion, his occasional bouts of agitation, and the simple, relentless demands of daily care was becoming a weight I could barely carry alone. It was then that our youngest son, Nick, and his wife, Jennifer, swept in like saviors. They lived only an hour away, in a cramped apartment with rent they constantly complained about. "Mom, you can't do this by yourself," Nick had said, his voice dripping with a manufactured solemnity that I now recognize as the first layer of his deception. "It's not safe for you, or for Dad. Jen and I have been talking. We want to move in. We'll take care of you both." Jennifer, perched on the edge of my floral armchair, had nodded vigorously, her smile a little too bright, a little too practiced. "Oh, Madeline, we would be honored. This big house is too much for you anyway. We can handle the cooking, the cleaning, the heavy lifting. You've spent your whole life taking care of everyone else. It's time someone took care of you." The words were like a balm on my frayed nerves. I saw them not as they were, but as I desperately needed them to be. My loving son and his caring wife, stepping up to repay a lifetime of devotion. The relief was so profound it felt like a physical release, a loosening of a knot that had been tightening in my chest for months. I agreed. Of course, I agreed. I saw it as a blessing, a solution delivered by the very family I had nurtured. I was a fool. I had mistaken a vulture for a dove. The first few weeks were a performance of saccharine perfection. Jennifer would hum as she tidied the kitchen, reorganizing my spice rack into alphabetical order and clucking her tongue at the ancient tins of paprika I'd had for years. Nick would put a firm, guiding arm around his father when Howard grew disoriented, steering him back to his chair with a patient, "Easy there, Pop. Let's sit down." They called me from the grocery store to ask what kind of yogurt I preferred and insisted I put my feet up while they handled dinner. It was a beautiful, meticulously crafted illusion, and I sank into it, grateful and blind. I ignored the small, discordant notes that pricked at the edge of my consciousness. The way Jennifer's eyes would sweep over my antique furniture, a flicker of something acquisitive in her gaze. The way Nick's patience with his father seemed to wear thin the moment he thought I was out of earshot, his voice losing its gentle cadence and taking on a sharp, irritated edge. The shift was gradual, a slow poisoning of the atmosphere in my own home. It started with my finances. "Mom, this is just too complicated for you to handle," Nick said one afternoon, spreading my bank statements across the dining room table. He pointed a finger at a utility bill. "You're overpaying here. And this insurance premium is outrageous. Let me take over the accounts. I can consolidate everything, make it easier for you. You won't have to worry about a thing." Worry. That was the word he used to cage me. Everything they did was framed as a way to spare me from worry. I, who had managed the household budget for 5 decades, who had stretched Howard's modest salary to raise 2 boys, put them through college, and pay off this very house, was suddenly deemed incapable of reading a bill. But I was tired, and the thought of shedding that particular burden was tempting. I handed over my passwords and my checkbooks. I signed the papers he put in front of me, his pen hovering impatiently. It felt like I was signing away a piece of myself, but I told myself it was for the best. Once they had control of the money, the mask began to slip more frequently. The home-cooked meals became greasy takeout, the boxes left on the counter for me to clean up. Jennifer's humming was replaced by long, loud phone conversations with her friends, where she'd complain in a stage whisper about how draining it was to care for the elderly. Honestly, Carol, it's a full-time job, and the house is so dated. We're thinking of doing some renovations, but of course, everything has to be approved. My home, the one Howard and I had filled with love and laughter, was now just the house, a project to be managed and critiqued. My opinion was no longer sought. It was an obstacle to be approved. They began to treat me like a tenant, a doddering old woman who was in their way. They started using my car without asking, leaving the gas tank empty. They ate the special foods I bought for Howard's sensitive stomach. Small things, yes, but they were like 1,000 tiny cuts, each one a reminder of my lost autonomy. The true cruelty, however, was reserved for Howard. My gentle, kind husband, lost in the mists of his own mind, became the primary target of their resentment. He wasn't a person to them. He was an inconvenience. When he would shuffle into the living room, confused about the time of day, Nick would sigh with theatrical frustration. "For God's sake, Dad, it's 3 p.m. We've been over this. Go sit down." The words were stones thrown at a man who could no longer build a wall to protect himself. I would watch from the doorway, my heart a cold, hard knot in my chest, and I would try to intervene.
He doesn't understand, Nick.
"You have to be patient." My son would turn his gaze on me, and it was like looking at a stranger. His eyes were flat, dismissive. "I am being patient, Mom. You have no idea what it's like dealing with this all day." He made it sound as though Howard's illness was a personal affront, a deliberate act of provocation. Jennifer was worse. She would speak about him as if he weren't there, her voice laced with a venomous pity. "Poor thing. He spilled his juice again. I just mopped that floor." She would scrub the spot with a grimace, making sure I saw her martyrdom. The first true moment of awakening, the one that shattered my denial, came on a Tuesday. I had been in the garden, my one remaining sanctuary, pulling weeds from my rose bushes. When I came back inside, the house was quiet. Too quiet. I found Howard in his armchair, staring blankly at the television, which was off. There were tear tracks on his weathered cheeks. This was unusual. Even in his confusion, Howard was rarely a man who cried. I knelt before him, taking his large, trembling hand in mine. "Howard, my love, what's wrong? What happened?" He looked at me, and for a fleeting moment, a flicker of the old clarity returned to his eyes. It was a look of such profound shame and fear that it stole the air from my lungs. He couldn't find the words, but he lifted his arm and pointed a shaky finger toward the kitchen. "Gone," he whispered.
She said.
"Gone." I walked into the kitchen, my footsteps unnaturally loud in the silence. On the counter was a small, empty space where a tarnished silver picture frame had always sat. It held a photograph of Howard and me on our wedding day, his young face beaming, my own alight with a joy so pure it felt like it belonged to another lifetime. It was my most treasured possession. I found Jennifer in the living room, scrolling through her phone. My voice was tight, a wire of controlled fury. "Jennifer, where's the photograph?" She didn't look up. "Oh, that old thing?" I put it away. It was so faded and dusty. It was making the whole counter look cluttered. "Put it away," as if it were a stray piece of junk mail. "Where did you put it?" I asked, the wire tightening. She finally glanced up, her expression one of mild annoyance. "In a box in the attic, I guess." Honestly, Madeline, it's not a big deal. Not a big deal. The casual cruelty of it, the utter dismissal of 60 years of shared history, of a memory that was one of the few anchors Howard had left, was staggering. I didn't argue. I didn't scream. I simply turned, walked up the rickety attic stairs, and found the box. It was shoved behind a pile of old Christmas decorations. I retrieved my photograph and brought it back downstairs. I placed it not on the kitchen counter, but on the nightstand beside my bed, a place where she would have no excuse to touch it. As I wiped the glass clean, I looked at our young, hopeful faces, and I felt a profound and terrible shift inside me. The soft, forgiving mother, the patient, understanding wife, began to recede. In her place, something colder and harder began to form. It was a crystal of pure, unadulterated rage. I realized then that I wasn't living with caregivers. I was living with captors. They weren't helping me. They were consuming me, devouring my home, my finances, my memories, and the dignity of my husband, piece by painful piece. That night, I did not sleep. I lay awake in the dark, the weight of my husband's hand in mine, and I began to plan. My first thought was of my other son, Tom. He lived across the country, a successful architect with a family of his own. We spoke every Sunday, and in our conversations, I had painted a rosy picture of my new living arrangement. I had praised Nick and Jennifer, telling Tom what a relief it was to have them here. The shame of admitting the truth was a physical barrier. How could I tell him I had let his brother and sister-in-law colonize my life? How could I explain the 1,000 small surrenders that had led to this unbearable present? I felt like a failure, a captain who had willingly handed her ship over to pirates. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that if I called him and simply told him what was happening, Nick and Jennifer would deny everything. They would paint me as a confused, ungrateful old woman, perhaps even suggesting that Howard's dementia was contagious, that my own mind was starting to go. It would be my word against theirs, and they were experts at the game of manipulation. I needed more than words. I needed proof. The idea came to me from a television show, a crime drama I'd watched one lonely afternoon. The thought of it, at first, seemed absurd. Secret cameras. Espionage. It was the stuff of movies, not the quiet, suburban life of a 71-year-old woman. But the more I considered it, the more logical it became. It was the only way to show Tom, to show the world, what was happening behind the closed doors of my own home. The next day, I told Nick I had a doctor's appointment. It was a lie, but it fell from my lips with surprising ease. Deception, I was learning, was a necessary tool for survival. "Do you need me to drive you?" he asked, his voice laced with that familiar, false concern. "No, dear," I said, my voice steady. "I can manage. I might stop and see a friend afterward." I drove not to the doctor, but to a large electronics store on the other side of town. I felt a tremor of fear as I walked through the automatic doors, a feeling of being an imposter in this world of sleek gadgets and technical jargon. I found a young man with a kind face and told him a modified version of the truth. I told him I was worried about my husband, that he was prone to falling when I wasn't in the room, and that I wanted to be able to keep an eye on him. He was sympathetic and helpful, showing me tiny, wireless cameras, no bigger than a sugar cube, that could be monitored from a simple application on a tablet. "They're motion-activated," he explained, "and the footage saves to a secure cloud server, so you can access it from anywhere." I bought 4 of them, along with a new tablet, using the emergency credit card I kept hidden in my jewelry box, a card Nick knew nothing about. The purchase felt monumental, a declaration of war. Driving home, my heart hammered against my ribs. I was terrified of being discovered. The cameras felt like tiny, ticking bombs in my handbag. The installation was the hardest part. I had to wait for the perfect opportunity, a time when both Nick and Jennifer would be out of the house for several hours. It came the following Saturday, when they announced they were going to a matinee movie and then out for dinner with friends. "You'll be okay with Dad, right, Mom?" Nick asked, already halfway out the door. "Of course," I said, my voice betraying none of the frantic energy coursing through my veins. The moment their car pulled out of the driveway, I flew into action. I felt like a spy in my own home, my movements swift and silent. One camera went in the living room, tucked into the foliage of a large silk plant. Another went on the high shelf of the bookcase in the den, hidden between 2 thick volumes of an old encyclopedia set. The third was the most crucial. It went in the kitchen, nestled behind the cookie jar on the counter, with a clear view of the table and the stove. The last one I placed in the hallway, aimed toward Howard's bedroom door. Setting them up with a tablet was surprisingly simple. Within an hour, I had 4 live feeds of my own home displayed on the screen. The feeling was dizzying, a strange mixture of power and transgression. I was watching them. Now I would see everything. I didn't have to wait long. The very first evening, the footage confirmed my worst fears, and then some. I would retreat to my bedroom, feigning a headache, and watch the tiny, silent movie of my life unfold on the tablet screen. I saw Jennifer walk into the kitchen, open the refrigerator, and take a long drink directly from the carton of orange juice I had bought specifically for Howard. I saw Nick sit beside his father on the sofa. Howard was trying to tell him a story, a jumbled, fragmented memory from his youth. I saw Nick pick up his phone, his thumb scrolling endlessly, completely ignoring the man beside him. Then I saw Howard reach out and touch his son's arm, a simple plea for connection. Nick flinched, pulling his arm away as if he'd been touched by something unclean. "Don't, Dad," he snapped, his voice a low growl that the camera's microphone picked up with perfect clarity. "Just watch the TV." Howard shrank back into the cushions, his face crumpling in confusion and hurt. Watching it on the screen, detached and silent, was somehow even more painful than seeing it in person. It was clinical. It was evidence. Day after day, I collected my evidence. The tablet became my constant, secret companion. I recorded Nick mocking his father's shuffling walk behind his back. I recorded Jennifer rifling through my desk drawers, looking for who knows what. I recorded them having a whispered argument in the kitchen about how much longer they would have to put up with this before they could convince me to sell the house and move us both into a facility. The word facility hung in the air like a death sentence. They weren't just neglecting us. They were actively plotting to dispose of us. Each new recording was another stone in the foundation of my resolve. My grief was slowly being baked away by the heat of my anger, leaving something dense and solid in its place. I was no longer just a victim. I was a prosecutor, building my case. I began to change. My fear, which had been a constant, chilling companion, began to subside. It was replaced by a cold, calm certainty. Knowing I had the truth recorded and stored safely in a digital cloud gave me a strange kind of courage. I started to push back in small ways, testing the boundaries of their tyranny. One morning, Jennifer announced that she was getting rid of my old, comfortable chintz sofa. "It's an eyesore, Madeline. We're going to get something modern." In gray, the old me would have acquiesced, avoiding conflict at all costs. The new me simply looked at her and said, "No," just that one word. She stared at me, her mouth slightly agape. "What do you mean, no?" "I mean no," I repeated, my voice even and calm. That sofa was a gift from Howard's mother. "It stays. This is my house, Jennifer. And that is my sofa." The look on her face was a mixture of shock and fury. She was so accustomed to my compliance that my sudden resistance was like running into a brick wall. She sputtered for a moment, then turned and stormed out of the room. Later, on my tablet, I watched her complain to Nick in the kitchen. "Your mother is getting difficult," she hissed. "She's losing it. We need to speed things up." They saw my strength as a symptom of senility. The irony was so bitter it almost made me laugh. My newfound assertiveness only made them escalate their campaign of psychological warfare. They began to gaslight me, as I believe the younger generation calls it. They would move my keys and then watch with feigned concern as I searched for them in a panic. "Are you sure you didn't misplace them again, Mom?" Nick would say, his voice dripping with faux sympathy. "You've been so forgetful lately." They were trying to build a narrative to create their own evidence that I was incompetent, that I was the one who needed to be managed. But their petty cruelties no longer wounded me. I saw them for what they were, the desperate maneuvers of cornered rats. I knew the truth. I had it all on video. The final piece of my plan was to contact Tom. I waited until I had amassed 2 months of footage, a catalog of cruelty and deceit that was undeniable. I called him on a Tuesday morning when I knew Nick and Jennifer were out. My hand trembled as I dialed his number. The years of protecting my children from each other, of trying to keep the peace, had created a deep-seated habit of downplaying Nick's flaws. This felt like a betrayal of that old instinct, but I knew it was necessary. "Tom," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "I need you to come home. Something is wrong." I didn't elaborate. I didn't want to have this conversation over the phone, where my words could be twisted or misunderstood. I just needed him here. To his credit, he didn't question me. He heard the steel in my voice, a tone he hadn't heard in years. I'm on the next flight, Mom, he said simply. I'll be there tomorrow. That night, the night before Tom was due to arrive, was the night it all came to a head. It was as if the universe, having watched me set the stage, had decided it was time for the curtain to rise on the final act. We were having dinner, a tense, silent affair. Jennifer had made a greasy casserole that sat like a stone in my stomach. Howard was having a difficult evening. He was agitated, his hands trembling as he tried to manage his fork. He picked up his plate, intending to carry it to the sink, but his coordination failed him. The plate slipped from his grasp, followed by another, and they shattered on the tile floor, a cascade of breaking porcelain. The sound was deafening in the strained silence. Howard froze, his eyes wide with fear. He looked like a child who had just broken his mother's favorite vase. "Oh," he whispered, his voice trembling.
Oh, dear.
I made a mess before I could even open my mouth to reassure him, to tell him it was just a plate, that it didn't matter. Nick was on his feet. His face was a mask of pure rage, a terrifying, mottled red. The months of feigned patience, of simmering resentment, boiled over in an instant. "For God's sake, Dad," he roared, his voice cracking with fury. "Can't you do anything right? They're just plates. Just stupid plates." He took a step toward his father, his body radiating a menace that filled the entire room. I saw Howard flinch, cowering away from his own son. And then it happened. Nick raised his hand and struck his father across the face. It wasn't a hard slap, not enough to leave a serious mark. But it was the intent behind it, the contempt, the utter violation of it. He had hit a frail, confused, 85-year-old man. He had hit his own father. The sound of it echoed in the sudden, horrified silence. Jennifer gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Howard stood perfectly still, his hand touching his cheek, his face a mask of utter, uncomprehending shock. In that moment, something inside me went perfectly, terrifyingly calm. All the anger, all the fear, all the grief I had been carrying for months coalesced into a single point of cold, hard clarity. The dam didn't just break, it vaporized. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the floor. I looked at my son, this stranger with a monster living behind his eyes. His chest was heaving, the rage still coursing through him. Then I looked at Jennifer, who was already recalibrating, her expression shifting from shock to a kind of defensive justification. I knew what she would say. She would say Howard had been difficult, that Nick was under a lot of stress, that it was just a little tap. They would spin it, twist it, and try to make me believe I hadn't seen what I had just seen. But I had more than just my own eyes. "Sit down, Nick," I said. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the tension like a shard of glass. He turned to me, his eyes still wild. "He broke the plates, Mom." "He's always," I said. I interrupted, my voice dropping even lower, colder. "Sit down." To my surprise, he did. He sank back into his chair, the rage beginning to recede, replaced by a sullen confusion. Jennifer watched me, her eyes narrowed, sensing a shift in the power dynamic she couldn't yet understand. I walked over to the sideboard in the dining room and picked up the tablet I had left there earlier. I turned it on, my fingers moving with deliberate, unhurried precision. I tapped the screen a few times, opening the application. Then I turned the tablet around so they could both see the screen. It showed 4 small windows, each one a live feed of a room in my house. The kitchen, the living room,
The den.
the hallway. Jennifer's eyes widened. She stared at the screen, then looked around the room, her gaze darting toward the cookie jar on the counter. A slow, dawning horror spread across her face. Nick just stared, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What is this?" he demanded. "This," I said, my voice as level as a frozen lake, "is my insurance policy. I installed them 2 months ago. Tiny little cameras. They're motion activated, and they record everything. Every word, every action. The footage, you see, is saved to a secure cloud server. It's quite convenient. I let the words hang in the air. I watched the color drain from Jennifer's face. I saw the first flicker of genuine fear in my son's eyes as the implications of what I was saying began to sink into his thick skull. "I have a recording of you, Jennifer, going through my private desk," I said, my gaze fixed on her. "I have a recording of you telling your friend Carol that you were planning to put us in a facility. I have a recording of you complaining that my wedding photograph was cluttering up the counter." Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Then I turned my attention to Nick. "And you, my son. I have footage of you mocking your father's walk. I have you on audio, telling him to shut up when he tries to speak to you. I have hours and hours of your patient care. And just now," I tapped the screen, bringing up the feed from the kitchen camera. "I have a perfect, high-definition recording of you striking your sick, elderly father for the crime of breaking a few plates." I hit the rewind button and played the last 30 seconds for them. We all watched in silence, the plates shattering, Nick's roar of fury, and the ugly, sharp movement of his hand connecting with Howard's cheek. The slap seemed even louder on the recording. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of total and complete annihilation. They had been exposed, their carefully constructed facade of care and concern ripped away to reveal the greedy, cruel ugliness beneath. Nick stared at the screen, his face ashen. He looked like a man who had just watched his own execution.
You.
"You were spying on us," he finally choked out, the words thick with disbelief and outrage. A small, bitter laugh escaped my lips. "Spying?
No, ni cholas.
I was documenting. I was gathering evidence of the abuse that has been taking place in my own home, under my own roof. You came into this house promising to take care of us. Instead, you have tormented a helpless old man. You have stolen from me, and you have tried to systematically erase my existence. You didn't see a family to be cared for. You saw an asset to be liquidated." It was then that the doorbell rang. Jennifer jumped, a small, startled cry escaping her lips. Nick looked toward the door, his eyes wide with a new kind of panic. "Who is that?" I didn't answer. I simply walked to the front door and opened it. Standing on the porch, his face grim and his suitcase in his hand, was my son Tom. He looked past me, his eyes taking in the scene in the kitchen, the shattered plates on the floor, Howard standing stunned and silent, Nick and Jennifer frozen at the table like guilty statues. "Mom," he said, his voice low. "What's going on?" "Your brother," I said, turning to look back at Nick with an expression devoid of all warmth, "was just giving his father a lesson in discipline." I stepped aside to let Tom in. He walked into the kitchen, his gaze sweeping over the scene, his expression hardening with every passing second. He looked at Howard's face, at Nick's cowering posture, and he understood.
He didn't need the videos, not yet.
He could see the truth written in the air. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Tom took control with a quiet, firm authority that left no room for argument. He first went to his father, putting a gentle arm around his shoulders. "It's okay, Dad," he said softly. "I'm here now. Everything is going to be okay." He led Howard to his bedroom, settled him down, and sat with him until the tremors of shock had subsided. Then he came back to the kitchen, where Nick and Jennifer were still sitting, trapped in the wreckage of their own making. Tom's voice was dangerously calm. "Pack your things. I want you out of this house tonight." Nick started to bluster, to protest. "You can't just kick us out. We live here. We've been taking care of them." Tom just looked at him, his eyes filled with a disappointment so profound it was more damning than any rage. "I've already seen some of the videos Mom sent me," he said, and the lie was so perfect, so beautifully timed, that I almost believed it myself.
"I saw what you did, Nick."
"There's nothing to discuss. Get your things and get out of my parents' house." Jennifer burst into tears, a theatrical, self-pitying display that had no effect on anyone. They scurried around the house, throwing their belongings into bags and boxes, their movements furtive and shamed. They didn't speak to me. They didn't even look at me. An hour later, they were gone. The sound of their car speeding away down the street was the sweetest music I had ever heard. The silence they left behind was vast and clean. It was a healing silence. Tom and I cleaned up the broken plates together, sweeping the shards into a dustpan. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. He knew. Later that evening, after Howard was asleep, we sat at the kitchen table and I showed him everything. I played clip after clip, my own private horror film. He watched it all, his face a grim, tightening mask of sorrow and fury. When it was over, he reached across the table and took my hand. "I'm so sorry, Mom," he whispered. "I'm so sorry I wasn't here. I should have known. You couldn't have known," I told him, and I meant it. I didn't want you to know.
But I know now.
I see everything clearly. The next few days were a blur of cleansing activity. Tom was a whirlwind of competence and care. He hired a financial advisor to help me untangle the mess Nick had made of my accounts. It turned out my son had been systematically siphoning money from my savings, thousands of dollars, to pay for his car, his credit card bills, his entire life. The evidence was all there in the bank statements. We also hired a lawyer who looked at the video evidence with a grave expression and told me we had a very strong case for elder abuse and financial exploitation. We didn't press charges. I couldn't bring myself to send my own son to prison, but we used the threat to ensure that every single penny he had stolen was returned, and that a legal document was drawn up forbidding him and Jennifer from ever contacting us again. Most importantly, Tom arranged for professional help for Howard. He found a wonderful home care agency. 2 women, Maria and Claire, began coming in shifts. They were kind, patient, and treated Howard with a gentle respect that brought tears to my eyes. They knew how to handle his confusion, how to soothe his agitation. They bathed him, they talked to him, they played his old music for him. For the first time in years, I wasn't just a caregiver. I could be his wife again. I could sit with him and hold his hand, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. The weight that had been crushing me was lifted. I could breathe. My house became my own again. I put my photograph back on the kitchen counter. I bought a new, brightly colored rug for the living room. I filled the rooms with flowers and music. The oppressive, toxic atmosphere created by Nick and Jennifer slowly dissipated, replaced by peace and light. Tom stayed for 2 weeks, helping me reset my life, and when he left, it was with a promise to visit every month and to call every day. I had my son back. I had my home back. Most of all, I had myself back. I had discovered a strength I never knew I possessed, a core of steel forged in the fire of betrayal. I learned that being a mother doesn't mean you have to be a martyr, and that love does not require the sacrifice of your own dignity. I sometimes wonder what became of Nick and Jennifer. I imagine their lives are small and bitter, poisoned by their own greed and resentment. I feel a flicker of pity for them, but it is a distant, detached emotion. They made their choices. They chose cruelty over kindness, theft over love. And now they are living with the consequences. My life, on the other hand, has blossomed. With the help of Maria and Claire, I have time for myself again. I've reconnected with old friends. I've joined a book club. I've started painting again, a passion I had abandoned decades ago. My days are filled with quiet joy and a profound sense of peace. I have my husband, my home, and my self-respect. I have won. What would you do in my place? Would you have found the strength to fight back, or would you have continued to suffer in silence? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and it helps to know that people understand. Where in the world did you hear my story today? I find it comforting to imagine these words reaching kind hearts in faraway places. If you found strength in my story, please consider liking this video and subscribing to my channel. There are many other stories waiting for you, tales of resilience and justice that remind us that even in the darkest of times, we can find our light. Your support through comments or even a super thanks helps me continue to share these important messages. With heartfelt greetings. Until next time.